Hello, everyone. I'm Rachel Kazer with GamesBeat, and welcome to today's discussion on trust and safety regulations and why they matter to game developers. This is a complement to our GamesBeat special issue, and I'm so glad to be here with our speakers today. And if you'd all be so good as to introduce yourselves, Connie, why don't we start with you? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, thank you, Rachel. My name is Conny Ewold. I'm a German attorney based in Cologne, Germany, a tech and media law partner with the international law firm Osborne Clarke. So I'm practicing games law since more than 20 years, and I'm running Europe's leading video game law blog, videogamelaw.org.
Thank you so much. Kim, what about you?
Yeah, I'm Kim Kunis, and I'm the general manager of Xbox Trust and Safety. So my team is responsible for assuring that all players have safe, welcoming, and inclusive experiences on Xbox.
Excellent. And Mike, you're pulling up last?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I'm Mike. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders at Modulate. We're a company building cutting-edge voice moderation software for games such as Riot Games and Rec Room, and trying to help platforms identify everything ranging from hate speech and harassment up to the really horrible and insidious stuff like child grooming and violent radicalization.
Wow. On that note, that means we've got a lot of ground to cover. So I think why don't we start with something a little bit basic and then we can branch out into the larger topic. And you've all obviously got a lot to say on the topic. So I think we'll start with I'd ask if you can give me a snapshot of what the regulatory landscape looks like right now for the games industry and what you think it's going to look like in the near future. And Mike, since you were last in the intros, why don't you go first?
Sure. I'm going to leave some pieces for both Kim and Connie, especially for Connie to talk about the DSA, which he is far more expert in. But I think the quick answer here is there's just so much going on in this space right now. In the last year or two, we've really seen regulators paying a lot closer attention to the idea of trust and safety, both in terms of problems around, that really insidious stuff that I mentioned, child safety, violent radicalization, but also just being more aware of the myriad mental health problems and difficulties that people face on platforms that aren't sufficiently regulated or moderated today. Um, a couple of agencies that I'm aware of thinking about this beyond, the EU and the DSA and all of the stuff happening in the US, are of course the UK with their online safety bill that's been in the works for a couple of years now, but is now finally nearing the finish line, and will be adding some additional controls, encouraging studios to be much more proactive in the way that they're thinking about risk mitigation and preparedness for these kinds of harms to occur on their platform. And then the e-Safety Commission out of Australia has been working hard to produce guidance for a variety of different industries on how they can be engaged more effectively with trust and safety. One of the industries they've been paying the closest attention to is the sort of gaming and broader social platform space, which was one of the few spaces where the industry's own sort of code of regulations produced for the e-Safety Commission to review was denied because the commission felt that it was insufficiently protective in a variety of different ways, especially around looking for platforms to, again, be more proactive in anticipating the kinds of harms that can happen online and doing something more aggressively to mitigate those harms. So that general theme of be really proactive and thoughtful upfront and safety by design is, I think, the biggest theme of the regulation today.
Makes sense. Kim, what do you think? What do you think of the regulatory landscape right now? Before we let Connie jump in with his European viewpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. So for us, really, we're delivering a platform company. We're delivering to a global market, and so we've long worked extensively with regulators around the world, as well as industry partners, and we have a cooperative approach with other platforms as well on this topic. Things are rapidly evolving in this space. Regulators around the world are recognizing a need to look deeper into how users are experiencing platforms, safety across those platforms. And so for us, really, we like to look at it as, it's not just about checking that regulatory box. It's really about, how do we do this in a way that is good for our players? How do we do it in a way that helps to drive consistency across platforms and experiences for players. And so what that really means for us is, continuing to have deep conversations with regulators, continuing to kind of iterate on how we solve for some of these requirements and working with them on that. So that's become a big theme of it for us. And I know that, my conversations with Mike previously, this is something that many, not only platform providers, but other providers in the space really struggle to continue to drive that consistency approach, because at the end of the day, it's the players that will suffer if we're not able to really get that right. And so that's something that we're really focused on within Xbox at Microsoft.
Okay. Connie, why don't you go ahead with your, because you have a different perspective on this than the other people on this panel. So I'm curious to see what you have to say about what the regulatory landscape looks like right now.
Yeah, true. I mean, I have the European perspective for obvious reasons. And when it comes to internet trust and safety, we see a lot of initiatives from the regulators, both on a national but also on a European level. For the EU, the most significant one and really a landmark regulation is the so-called Digital Services Act, or the DSA as we call it. It entered into force already last year, but applies all over the EU from early next year on. And this is the right moment in time then for games companies to deal with that. It's a massive piece of legislation. It introduces completely new rules on liability, dealing with disinformation, illegal goods and content, cyber violence, dark patterns, and targeted advertisements. So quite a broad range of topics. And at the same time, it also introduces significant fines. So we are speaking of potential fines of up to 6% of the global turnover of a company. And very important, it is not only relevant for companies that are based within the EU, it's relevant for all companies doing business within the EU, even if they do not have a physical presence within the EU. So also US companies, companies from Asia, Australia, are affected if they are targeting European customers.
Right. So you've all brought up a bunch of changes that are coming in the near future and, well, the far future as well, but especially the near future. So I'm curious, how big of a cultural shift is this going to be for the average game company, especially once these trust and safety regulations become reality? And Connie, since you're on a roll, why don't we start with you?
I think the change is very important. I mean, a games company wants, in first instance, create great games for its customers, and they want to market their games. But now these days, because of all the regulatory changes, games companies suddenly have to make compliance with all the new rules a top priority. And also because of the heavy fines, which I've just mentioned, consequences of not observing all these new rules could be quite significant. So making compliance with all the new rules and regulations part of the entire game design process, the design of the game interfaces, but also of all legal documents companies are using is of utmost importance, and therefore the shift is quite significant.
Mike, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with everything Connie's saying. I'll also say I think there's always been an implicit and kind of healthy tension between privacy and safety in some sense in regulation. Privacy is don't collect data. Safety is look at the data so that you can protect people from the bad things that are happening. They're both there to protect users, but in the past, there's been much more comprehensive privacy regulation than safety regulation, and it's led in many cases to a sort of skew for platforms to prioritize privacy protocols over safety protocols. So I think, Connie mentioned just the size of this shift is large. I think the direction of this shift, it's not away from privacy. I want to be clear about that. Privacy is still hugely important, but it's finding a healthier balance between privacy and safety that acknowledges that both are in fact critical to a healthy platform and a healthy community.
And Kim, I'm interested to get your opinion as well because I mean, obviously Xbox is a games company, so I'd be interested to see what you think the impact is going to be for your people.
Yeah, absolutely. Love the comments from Mike and Connie, and that is such a huge part of it as we look at this change happening and really has to be part of our DNA as a game provider, foundationally to think about safety from the ground up and from day one. At Xbox, we agree with regulators that tech companies provide a really important role in keeping users safe. And so, that is absolutely part of how we think about this end to end. So I really think there's a lot here that is positive at the end of the day for, our players, for our communities as a whole. And so really, really agree with that idea of safety by design. And I think that's really the key in this cultural shift. Is that it's got to be part of that conversation from day one. It's got to be part of how we think about developing platforms, developing content, bringing users together into communities. So yeah, it's a great evolution I think that's going on that will really benefit companies and players, communities alike.
And so now that we know that this is going to be how big an impact this change is going to have, I'm curious to know how developers, especially smaller developers, can prepare for the changes that they're going to have to make before regulations actually become a reality for them. And again, Kim, since you are from the games company, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about it.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been a big topic of conversation for us, not only internally, but with our partners as well. And as, regulatory change becomes more ubiquitous across markets, what we hear from our customers, from our partners, is that this can be kind of challenging, especially for smaller companies. Understanding the landscape of what needs to be done to meet requirements, but also, as I talked about earlier, how do you do that in a way that provides for the best consumer experiences within your platform or your service? And so that becomes an important part of how we collaborate together across ourselves as partners in the gaming industry for us at Xbox, but also with regulators as they start to evaluate some of the requirements that they'll roll out and how those may be implemented by different services. So really for us, it's about safety being part of the onset of design and development. We hear that from our partners as well. So kind of making it part of that safety by design, like we talked about a few minutes ago, um, foundationally from day one. And then figuring out how do we kind of orchestrate over time and iterate on the changes as they come out. We'll learn things as we roll out changes based on regulatory change. And so there's that feedback loop with our users, with our partners, and then also back with regulators. It is not a one time sort of fire and forget change. It's something that we will have to evolve over time as we learn. And I think that's a really important piece of it. To kind of realize and have the humbleness to realize that we won't necessarily always get it perfect from the first day, but we're open to that constant feedback from our users and that collaboration with regulators and partners as we move forward.
That's it. That's fascinating. And Connie, I'd be eager to hear what you say from a legal perspective as well, not just from a games perspective, but also from, I guess, a games and legal perspective.
Yeah, I must say I very much like what Kim just explained. This is really the first step and super important for every games company. And it sounds easy, but it's difficult enough. In the first step for a games company, it's really understanding the new rules and regulations and really trying to figure out whether a games company is falling under the new rules. For the DSA, for example, it's quite complex. So this piece of legislation is not made for games companies only. It applies to quite a broad range of digital businesses, and games is just one of them. So in the first step, it's really necessary to read the new rules, to understand them, to speak with people that understand the new rules, that have the necessary experience, and to define which new obligations really apply to the business. The second step, once I've understood the new obligations, then it's necessary to set up new policies, new reporting obligations, and also to update terms and conditions. But it's not only that, it's also dealing with the new requirements in the entire games development process, which is difficult enough. And the DSA, as I mentioned already, is dealing a lot with illegal content. And illegal content happens when, as a games company, I gave my users the opportunity to provide user-generated content, or when I open communication channels where users can communicate with each other. Then I have the big challenge of identifying illegal content, which the DSA does not define, which is actually illegal. And if we are honest, games companies in the past have very much relied on reports by other users. Hey, this might be illegal. Please investigate whether this content is infringing third-party rights or is infringing the law, etc., etc. But under the new rules, this may not be enough anymore. So I need to think about new ways how I could identify illegal contents, and tools might be a good way to proactively address this issue in the future.
And since you've mentioned tools, I think I need to pass it over to Mike. So, Mike, how do you think developers can prepare for the changes that they're going to have to make for this regulation?
Yeah, I mean, Kim and Connie have both offered great perspectives here. I guess just kind of to tie it together in a certain sense. Kim talked about that iterative process where you're not necessarily going to get it perfect from the get go, which I absolutely agree with, and I think regulators are also aware of. And Connie, you just talked about the reliance on user reports and the need to be thinking in a more comprehensive way. For me, I certainly can't speak to any particular regulator, but when I'm having these conversations with regulators, the thing that I'm most consistently kind of hearing from them is don't overthink this. The thing that we're really asking for is for the platforms to show that they themselves are taking some responsibility for the safety of their users and trying. And the more the platform can show that they are genuinely, authentically trying, the more I can't make a promise, but the more lenience I think there will be from the regulatory side, compared to saying, oh, we have to perfectly figure out, to Connie's point, the exact definition of illegal content that is not well defined, or when exactly does it count as the best interest of the child. We're not mature enough in the trust and safety space to be at that level of nitpicking and sort of fine grained details. For now, I think the mission is try our best and start more proactively and more responsibly, doing what we can on the platform side to protect the users that come into these spaces we build.
And since we mentioned tools, and again, Mike, I'll start with you, but I would like to know more about the tools and design approaches that games companies can use and how also they can implement them at scale, because scale is also an issue here. So, Mike, like I said, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about tools obviously all day, and we've got not so long to talk about it, so I'll try and keep myself relatively brief. I think there's a couple really important trade-offs to be thinking about when you're considering what kinds of tools you want to be using. One is that trade-off I mentioned before between safety and privacy, finding that balance of how are you collecting data in a way that still respects the privacy of the end user in a strong way, while making sure that you can actually notice when, say, someone is trying to groom a child and that child is not going to know enough to hit that report button themselves. Really briefly, the philosophy we use at Modulate on the voice moderation side, I always use the analogy of taking your kid to the playground. You're not typically, looming behind your child, watching every single thing they do, listening to every single thing they say. You're maybe over at the sidewalk with some of the other parents, talking, but watching out of the corner of your eye. And that's enough to see a suspicious adult is walking up to your child, or they just fell off of the monkey bars, or a bunch of other kids are pointing and laughing. And you can use that prompt to come get a closer look and assess more deeply, do I need to be involved? How do I need to be involved? So that kind of balance of not necessarily watching everything from the get go, but watching enough to know when something is going wrong is a really important balance to learn how to strike with your tools. The other one that I'll briefly mention is the balance between relying on AI and human. And as the founder of an AI tech company, I would like to say loudly for all to hear, don't just use AI. That is not a good solution to trust and safety. You really need a balance between the AI, which can, to your point, Rachel, work much more efficiently at scale, but it's always going to need help from humans that have that deeper, more culturally nuanced understanding of everything that's happening to continually coach it and help it navigate those nuances, or in some cases, to just flag those situations directly to a team of human moderators that can do that deeper investigation in a more manual way for the really sensitive situations that require that extra level of nuance.
Mm, Kim, I'd also like to pass it over to you because you also mentioned safety by design at Xbox. And so I'd like to get your opinion on design approaches and scalability as well.
Absolutely. And I really like a lot of what Mike said, especially in the context of the use of AI and human moderation. And we really believe that there is such an important piece of layering your approach and really looking at this as a multifaceted problem. And when we look at, our proactive approach to content moderation, this is really about the automation that enables us to scale. But it is really important that with that automation that enables us to scale, we have that human piece of it too, and that we're layering that approach in terms of how we think about the content in our community. And then separately, there's a big difference between illegal content or content that doesn't meet our policies versus content that some players don't like. We don't think that safety is necessarily one size fits all. And so there's another facet of this that we haven't really discussed a lot yet, but really has to do with a player's expectations in that game. And for some players, and even sometimes the same player in different contexts, they may want to have a slightly different experience if they're playing a rated E game with their child versus an M game with friends, they may have a different expectation. And so some of our investments also really focus on how do we give that player choice? How do we allow them to have settings that they can dial up or down moderation? And then from, what do we do in the background operationally? Again, it's back to kind of layering that approach of automation and AI with humans that enable us to make the automation smarter and provide that context within our business and that community, and then that moment for the user as well.
Connie, do you have anything that you'd like to follow up to what Mike and Kim have said?
Well, I was just thinking about the aspects of distributing the right content to the right audiences. And when we think about the protection of minors in particular, which are, of course, important for every games company, then it is also important to think about the right way how to protect minors in games and to enable parents to use the right parental control systems to make sure that minors only play those games and see only that content that is appropriate for the relevant age groups. And I must say the industry made very good progress in that regard, and there are very good tools in place already. But it's important to understand this and to design the games accordingly.
So, how can and Connie, I'm going to direct this question at you as well, but how can companies create their own privacy, trust, and safety standards that work for them and also over and above what regulations ask of them? Because it's not enough just to follow the letter of the law, I would assume.
Yeah, I mean, for Europe, it's pretty much already if you follow the letters of the law. But still, your question is absolutely right, of course. I think the first step is really making compliance with internet regulation a top priority within the company. So you need to educate people, you need to assign enough resources on that topic in order to be able to make this a priority already when it comes to the game design process, but also then when you operate the game for your audiences. Because as we rightfully heard from Kim and Mike already, you need to have this layered approach, but the human element of this layered approach only works if people are educated and if they have enough time and resources to deal with all the new challenges. And when you do that, I'm pretty optimistic that you find the right level within your company. I mean, we have companies of different sizes, and every company needs to find the right balance, but it works for every company of each size, I'm pretty sure.
I am Makes sense to me. And Kim, I'd ask you the same question, but from a games company standpoint, how can you create your own standards? Because you mentioned that it's not one size fits all.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, if we all think about putting the user, the player at the center of it and evaluating how is this impacting them when we think about the ways that we might implement some of these requirements, I think that's really the key. And, for us, this is something that, as I mentioned earlier, we think about it from the day one aspect, so safety by design, but then we also need to think about it in the case of, this is an evolution for the player also. And do they understand what we're doing and why? And so finding ways to intuitively sort of communicate that within the experience that they understand, what we're doing with their data, how we're doing content moderation, the policies that we might have. So this kind of can be related to regulatory requirements, or it can be related to our community standards in terms of expectations on behaviors within our community. How do we make sure that we're clear about that with our players? And how do we take feedback from our players to assure that we also understand how they're experiencing that from us? So that's a big piece of it. And I think, the collaboration with our gaming partners. So, partners who provide content on our platform. So, studios, games, partners who are community partners, communications partners. All of that collaboration, and again, with the focus on the player, is a really critical part of it.
Mike, from your perspective, do you have anything else you'd like to follow up on?
Yeah, I guess I'll take the opportunity to nitpick the question just a little bit. You asked what can different studios and platforms do to put together their standards, and I'd like to say we shouldn't each be putting together our own standards. To what Kim brought up earlier, absolutely, trust and safety is not a one size fits all space. But for us to be able to communicate effectively with the end users, we as an industry have got to be aligned on the way that we talk about these topics and what kinds of standards it is that we're using. Going back to real world analogies, when you go into a library, we all generally kind of understand what you're supposed to do and not do in a library, right? There's a lot of rules that are kind of just well understood, well dissipated in the space. We don't really have that in the games industry yet. We have individual codes of conduct written often in heavy legalese, using different terminology to refer to different kinds of things. If we as an industry can get to a place that we have a good shared structure for what kinds of things we want to talk about, we're all going to find it so much easier to then express what makes our platform, our community different to those end users and still welcome them in a safe and robust way.
I enjoy your analogies, Mike. But so we're coming up on our final question, and I'd like to make this a little bit more of a general one. So, what challenges do you foresee for games companies, especially in the near future, and how do you think they can overcome these challenges? And Connie, I'm going to pick on you again to start.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest challenges is really that games companies operate globally and have to deal with different rules and regulations on our topic here. And in particular, for smaller companies, it's quite challenging to really understand and deal with all the new rules and regulations that come up at fast pace these days. There is a massive lack of guidance, so I very much hope that the industry itself, but also the legislator, will produce more guidance for the companies globally to deal with that, because the risk profile, as we discussed already, at the same time is pretty significant. So companies need some support in dealing with this topic, clearly.
Understandable. Kim, what about you? From a games perspective, what challenges do you think are coming, and how can especially smaller developers overcome those challenges?
Yeah, I think Mike made a great point in his response on that last question. And I think, we do have quite a variation of standards across the industry. And with this regulatory change, and as Connie said, the differences that are all kind of coming out from different parts of the world and affect global providers in very different ways. How do we bring this conversation together more as an industry? How do we get better about community standards? How do we share information more effectively for the good of everyone? And I think about we have a good gaming initiative between Xbox and PlayStation and Nintendo. And this is a forum where we really put competition aside and work together on, feedback to each other about what our experiences have been with our focus and investments on safety. And we can take some lessons, I think, that we've had from that experience with the other platform providers and really apply it more holistically as an industry so that we can, learn and advance together and try to create a situation where we can drive a little bit more consistency that I think will make it easier for everyone. And you mentioned the small companies and the challenges there, and that is certainly the case. So the more that we can do to standardize, to share tools that help with kind of the layering approach that I talked about earlier. Scale is a challenge for large companies, and that's where a lot of that automation comes in. Context is also a challenge as you go across even common content in gaming. You have differences in sort of how you need to think about the context when you're evaluating or classifying a piece of content from a content moderation safety perspective. So everything that we can do to collaborate with regulators, collaborate with partners, both small and large partners, to get to more consistency, I think at the end of the day will make this all better for the player. And truly, that's what we're all focused on: is how do we make the best experience that is safe for our players.
I love that answer. And Mike, you're gonna have to pull up the rear here. So what do you think about the challenges?
I mean, again, kind of echoing Kim and Connie, it turns out we've got some great people here who are offering a lot of great thoughts. I think the big problem statement is this is just a really big topic. Again, there's a lot of regulation across sort of the global terrain. There's a lot of complexity to the tools that we're able to implement. There's also complexity to what Kim's been bringing up around, the design and the context. Not only, hey, is this actually hate speech in this context, but what do you do about that? Do you just ban all of the bad users? Hint, no, you don't do that. That's not a good idea. But finding those balances, finding those effective strategies, it's really complex. It's really nuanced. It requires expertise. You cannot just slap trust and safety on at the end. And so my guidance for anyone large or small is find partners that you can trust, who you can really engage with in a deeper way to talk through what those strategies should look like. The more that we as an ecosystem are working together with each other through those kinds of partner relationships, that naturally brings us all into alignment as a full industry and enables everyone to rely on the expertise of folks that are able to spend their days really diving as deep into these problems as they truly deserve.
I could listen to all 3 of you talk all day about this topic. I love all the answers that we've come up with here, but unfortunately, that is all we have time for, and I'd like to thank all 3 of you for being here with me today and for participating in this Phoebe Spotlight.
Thank you,
Thanks for
Rachel.
having us.